This session is called Israel, the Land of Miracles. We've talked in other sessions about how the Jews are God's chosen people, a unique race of people on the face of the earth, because God is with them in a special way. The Bible also tells us that God views the actual geographic land of Israel differently to every other country on the face of the earth as well. In Deuteronomy 11 it says, "The land you are entering to take over is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come. The land you will take possession of is a land the Lord your God cares for. The eyes of the Lord your God are continually on it, from the beginning of the year to its end." Israel is the land of miracles. Now, we're all familiar with the miracles recorded in the Bible. Today we're going to look at some equally extraordinary miracles that have taken place in our modern TV era, many of which have been attested to by eyewitnesses who have given their stories to newspapers or on the television. David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, was an atheist in his youth. As he led the country through many of its hardest days, he witnessed firsthand so many unexplainable events that he himself became a believer in God. He said this, "In Israel, in order to be a realist, you must believe in the miracles." Some of the miracles came, as they do today, through God anointing and using ordinary people in an extraordinary way. Others came through supernatural interventions, interruptions of God where he broke into our world. But they're all miracles nonetheless. And in this session we're going to look very briefly at the birth of the nation of Israel and some of the miracles which have shaped the character of this nation over the last 70 years. So we'll start with the miracle of Israel's birth. After the Second World War finished, the British Empire was severely weakened and on the verge of bankruptcy. So they were more dependent on the Arab oil than ever before. Even after witnessing all the horrors of the Holocaust and seeing all these hundreds of thousands of Jews that were released from the camps and also, found here and there across Europe, they'd been driven out of their homes and they all wanted to go back to Israel, still Britain continued with the same policy that they had adopted in 1939, which was that they blocked any Jew going back to Palestine. And they forbade Jews from buying land in Palestine except in certain circumstances. And they were working towards an independent Arab state. So at that point in time, the Jews decided that they had no choice but to take up arms and fight against the British. After a year or two, the situation in Palestine became such a mess that Britain asked the newly formed United Nations to come up with a plan. The UN recommended that the land should be divided roughly half and half, with one half going to the Jews to make an independent Israel, the other half going to the Arabs. Jerusalem would remain under international guardianship. Now, for the plan to become legal, 2/3 of the United Nations Council had to vote for it. In the committee stage, the proposal fell one vote short, 25 votes against 13. The vote for the full assembly of the United Nations was scheduled for the 26th of November. The lobbying had indicated that the vote, if it had gone ahead on that date, it wouldn't have made the 2/3 majority. In the end, it was delayed for 3 days. And when it finally came to be voted on, a couple of nations had changed their mind, mainly due to aid packages that the US had offered to give to their particular nations. And inexplicably, one nation didn't show up for the vote. And so those 3 votes swung the course of history. Had it been 3 votes less than the 2/3 majority wouldn't have been reached. In the end, it was carried 33 votes to 13. It was a political miracle. The Jews accepted the UN decision. Finally, on the 14th of May 1948, the British pulled out of Palestine. On the same day, David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first Prime Minister, declared the formation of the State of Israel. In his Independence Day speech, Ben-Gurion said this: "By virtue of the natural and historic right of the Jewish people, and by resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations, we hereby proclaim the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine to be called Israel. We extend the hand of peace and the call to be good neighbours with all those countries and their peoples who surround us." 2,700 years before, the prophet Isaiah had prophesied this: "Can a nation be born in one day, or a nation be brought to forth in a moment?" In one day, the state of Israel had been born. On the same day, the Arabs rejected the UN decision and the Israeli call for peace. The Iraqi Prime Minister said, "We will smash the country with our guns and obliterate every place the Jews seek shelter in." Before Israel was 1 day old, 8 Arab nations came together. Their explicit aim was to drive the Jews out of Palestine, to destroy all Jewish settlements and to wipe the state of Israel off the map. The Egyptian generals told their government that the invasion would be a parade without any risks. Tel Aviv will be taken within 2 weeks. When war broke out, because the British had adopted this policy of disarming the Israelis, so the only weapons they had were homemade rifles that they'd made themselves secretly hidden from the British. They had no planes, no tanks, no military vehicles. It was a group of Holocaust survivors, rabbinic students, farmers and civilians with limited homemade weaponry, forced into battle against 8 fully equipped, large, war-hardened, experienced armies. Iraq, Egypt, Syria and Jordan all possessed air forces with hundreds of planes, hundreds of tanks and armoured vehicles. Many of the Arab generals had been trained and experienced fighting alongside the British generals in the Second World War. But by a miracle, Israel not just survived a couple of weeks, but actually won the war. There was one thing that the Arabs hadn't taken into consideration: the God of Israel. The Bible says, "Be strong and resolute. Do not be in fear or in dread of your enemies, for the Lord your God himself marches with you. He will not fail you or forsake you." When you start looking at the wars of modern day Israel, it really is like reading the Bible. There are literally hundreds of stories of God's miraculous intervention in the wars. Angels appearing, the literal hand of God appearing and smashing ammunition dumps of the enemy. And all backed up by eyewitnesses who've told their stories on television and to newspapers. The West Point Military Academy is the leading military training school in America. They run a course there called The History of Military Tactics and Field Strategies, where they survey wars through history. A student there once asked his professor, why didn't they study any of the battles fought by Israel against the Arabs? The normally friendly general snapped back that the student should see him in his office after class. In the privacy of his office, the general said, "Don't think that the staff here at West Point has left the Jewish wars unnoticed. We have examined and analysed them, but we do not teach them at West Point. According to military strategy and textbook tactics, the Jews should have lost them all. They should have been swept into the dustbin of history long ago, but they were not. They won those wars against all odds and against all military strategies and logic." Israel's victories don't make any sense unless you believe in the God of Israel and the possibility of miracles. God promised his people this when they went into battle. "You shall give chase to your enemies, and they shall fall before you. 5 of you shall give chase to 100, and 100 of you shall give chase to 10,000. Since its foundation, the nation of Israel has barely known any times without war. There's been a succession of wars, one after the other. Israel has won all the wars that it fought, and today has one of the strongest armies in the world. When the Arabs saw that they couldn't defeat Israel in battle, they changed their tactics and started waging a guerrilla war through terrorism and putting pressure on politically. All through its many wars, though, Israel has experienced literally thousands of supernatural miracles. And I'm just going to give you a few examples now. During the War of Independence, a few Israeli homemade armoured cars and trucks were on their way to help a besieged kibbutz in the north of the country, but they took a wrong turn and accidentally entered Lebanon. They didn't realise their mistake until they ran into a military convoy made up of dozens of Syrian armoured cars and trucks, also on their way to fight at the same kibbutz. The trucks were filled with soldiers, weapons and ammunition to support the Arabs who were attacking the Israelis. The scared Israelis fired into the convoy with their little rifles. Miraculously, they hit a large tank of gasoline that exploded, producing such a huge explosion that the sound could be heard for miles away. That tank of gasoline blew up the next truck in the convoy as well, which just happens to be filled with grenades. They exploded so violently that that explosion blew up the next truck. That was filled with shells, and that exploded and blew up the next truck. And one by one, every truck in the convoy exploded. The few Syrians who'd survived were so scared that they just ran off back towards Syria, leaving the Israelis to turn round and head back into Israel. When they finally reached the kibbutz, the Arabs had gone. Apparently they had heard rumours that the Jews had invaded the Lebanon, and so they returned back to Syria. Now in 1973, the Egyptians and the Syrians made a surprise sudden attack on Israel on the holiest day of the Israeli calendar, Yom Kippur. That was the day when the Jews widely observe fasting, prayer and rest. And so everyone was back in their homes, in their synagogues. Just at that moment, the Syrians and the Egyptians attacked. And they took the Israelis completely by surprise. The Egyptians penetrated deep inside the Sinai Peninsula in the south, and the Syrians quickly overran the Golan Heights in the north. The Syrian soldiers had been told to bring their civilian clothes with them because in a short time they'd been told they'd be in the cities of Tel Aviv and Haifa. And by the time the Israelis mobilized their tanks, the Syrian tanks were already just cresting over the last range of mountains of the Golan Heights, just an hour away from Haifa. There were 40 Israeli tanks facing 400 Syrian tanks. But as the Syrians came into view, something miraculous happened. Suddenly, this line of tanks all stopped. And for no explainable reason, they just turned round and started driving as fast as they could in the opposite direction, back towards Syria. The Israelis gave chase, but the Syrian tanks had gone as fast as they could back to their own country. Nobody could work out why, until later when they captured a Syrian commander and they asked, why did your tanks not fire on us? Why did you stop and turn round? The soldiers said that they'd seen a large white hand suddenly appearing in front of them, commanding them to stop, and a row of dozens of huge white angels blocking their way. And they became so scared that all of the tank drivers turned round and headed back to Syria. A reservist Israeli cab driver tells the story of how he and another reservist were on patrol, just driving his cab near the Tiran Straits in the south of the country. And suddenly they met with this heavily armed Egyptian half-track filled with Egyptian soldiers and a mounted machine gun position on the vehicle. The cab driver and his friend pointed their small little rifles at this heavy machinery, waited to be mowed down. But the half-track suddenly came to a halt and nothing happened. So the Israelis decided to cautiously approach it. Inside were 18 soldiers, all armed with machine guns, looking absolutely scared out of their lives. So one of the Israeli reservists shouted, "Hands up, get out of the vehicle." And to his amazement, all the Egyptian soldiers just quietly got out of the vehicle. When they tied them up, they asked the Egyptian commander, "Why didn't you shoot us? Why did you just stop?" And the man said, I don't know. We just suddenly froze. Our whole bodies became paralyzed and none of us could move. We became terrified. And when you came and said, "Get out of the vehicle," the only thing we could do was obey. There's another story of an Israeli Defense Force vehicle that was heavily laden with explosives, high explosives, which just parked up in Jerusalem to resupply the Israeli troops with ammunition. And the Arabs were shelling the area, so it was a dangerous job. If the vehicle had been hit, the whole thing would have exploded, just demolishing a few buildings and probably killing a lot of people. But in fact, while they were unloading, an Arab shell actually landed right in the vehicle. But instead of exploding, it just landed and sat there on top of all the Israeli shells. It didn't explode, and neither did the Israeli shells that it had landed upon. Now we're just going to watch a couple of short videos that tell some more stories about Israel's war miracles.
This must bring back a lot of memories for you being up here.
I'll tell you something, this is such nostalgia for me, especially after so many years, just to walk in the same place where I used to be. You know, this area over there, just in front of us there, if you can look there. We were on foot trying to find a way to get to this village.
So what do you do in a situation like that?
You get on your knees very quickly.
יש כאן איזה 100,000 מוקשים. לא חייבים לזחול את הדרך שלנו החוצה.
You take out your bayonet and you start finding mines.
This is a life-threatening situation. In other words, if you went forward, it was dangerous. What about just retreating?
Whichever way, whether it's to the left, to the right, backwards or forwards, I mean, it's a minefield. We did the best we could. And we dug ourselves, we managed to expose a few and dismantle them. And it was a very slow process. But at this particular point, a very, very strong gust of wind came. Something which we could not explain at all. I mean, it was so strong that we literally felt that we were flying away. That's how strong it was. And mines that were buried 25, 30 centimeters in the ground just exposed themselves, and we didn't have to dig them out. We were just walking through them.
In the morning, 5 soldiers of us were in front of the Zion Mountain, and thousands of Arabs started a counterattack to the Zion Mountain.
חבר'ה, יש לנו אורחים! יש לי רק 5 כדורים! אצלי 6! אצלי יש רק 4! אמרו לי רק 3 כדורים! טוב חבר'ה, היה כיף להכיר אתכם. אולי אין לנו שום סיכוי, אבל אנחנו יכולים להילחם כמו גדולים. לפחות כמה דקות. ואחר כך, אללה ירחמו. אל תדאגו. ניגמר מהר.
This guy named Shimon Mordechai Rapaport says that they shot the last bullet.
חבר'ה, נשאר לי רק כדור אחד אחרון.
אוי, זה הסוף.
And they were sure that's the end. They're going to be slaughtered.
זהו, זה נגמר, חבר'ה. זה נגמר. עשינו מה שיכולנו.
And the Arabs that felt that there are no more shooting, they started yelling, Itbach el Yahud, kills the Jews, and started running towards this emplacement. And suddenly, they heard the Arabs yelling, Ibrahim, Ibrahim, Ibrahim! Abraham, and running away. They have no idea what happened.
חבר'ה, הם בורחים! זה לא יאומן!
Shimon Mordechai Rapoport takes his cousin, Ira Rapoport, to the Mount of Zion and telling him his story 19 years beforehand. And there was an Arab over there that was sitting and hearing this story. This Arab comes over to him and tells him, just 1 second, you fought over here 19 years beforehand? He said, yes. I don't believe it. I was one of the Arabs that attacked. Oh, you tried to kill me, I tried to kill you. Shaking your head. But then Shimon Mordechai Rapoport asked him, just 1 second, I have to understand. Why did you run away? We didn't have any ammunition. The Arab told him, I don't believe. What, you didn't see what was over there? What are you talking about? What you really didn't see? What are you talking about? The Arab told him there was this huge guy over your emplacement that was going us with his hand. Oh, we were sure that's Abraham, you're the patriarchs, your father. We got so scared, we ran away. Unbelievable.
Now we're going to think about the miracle of the people's return. After Israel gained its independence, the Israeli government passed what they called the Law of Return, granting Israeli citizenship to anyone of Jewish descent who wanted to return wherever they were in the world. The doors of Israel were now open, and Jews from all over the world started hurrying back to their promised land. You can see from this graph how Jewish immigration dramatically increased after Israel's declaration of independence. You can also see the countries which they came from. Some were driven back to the land by events out of their control. Just like Isaiah prophesied, they were like clouds blown along by cold winds of persecution. Clouds have no possibility to determine themselves where they want to go. And many of the Jews had no choice. They were forced to leave their lands through persecution. For example, the 900,000 Jews who had lived, some of them for centuries, in the Arab countries. As soon as Israel declared its independence, the Arab nations became very hostile towards them, and the Jews were driven out. Many of them had to leave their homes, their businesses, all their money, everything they had, just leave them in those countries and just flee for their lives back to Israel. Others, like doves, chose to return and to make their family nest in the land of Israel. And there are some amazing stories of how these Jews came back. In one operation codenamed On Wings of Eagles, the entire population of Jews in Yemen, over 49,000 people, were flown home in one go on 380 planes. God was calling his people back home.
I'm meeting a young Ethiopian soldier from the Israeli Defense Forces. Major Miki Achiron is another of those who braved a difficult journey to come to this country. In 1984, some 7,000 Ethiopian Jews walked hundreds of miles across the open desert to reach a secret rendezvous known as Operation Moses.
אנשים תפסו את מה שהיה להם ועזבו לכיוון סודן. הדרך הייתה קשה מאוד. בלי מפה, בלי אמצעי ניווט, בלי מורה דרך. זאת הייתה הכמיהה לירושלים. לא משנה מה יש לך. ובדרך אנשים איבדו את היקר להם. ילדים איבדו את הוריהם, הוריהם איבדו את הילדים. לא באנו עם מזון מספיק. כי לא שארנו שנלך 40 יום, 60 יום. הדרך הייתה מפותלת, מקורות המים לא היו לנו.
Yet you kept on going. Why didn't you turn back?
Whether we died or not, we want to come to Israel.
You know, when you tell the story, it sounds like more than a piece of factual modern history. It sounds like something out of the Bible.
במובן מסוים היציאה שלנו מזכירה את יציאת המצרים. זה היה שווה את כל הסבל להגיע לישראל, להיות שותף למדינת היהודים. היום, אחרי 20 שנה שאני בישראל, אני רואה כי ישראל היא מדינה באמת מיוחדת, שיש בה הכל. היהודים מכל העולם, מכל הצבעים. זהו נס. נס שבאמת מחזיק אותה לאורך שנים, למרות שמדינה קטנה. אבל מה שיש בתוך המדינה הזאת הוא, it's something special. Every day when I wear these stuffs, I feel proud.
In a second effort to rescue the Jews of Ethiopia called Operation Solomon, a dramatic airlift secretly negotiated with their government, 15,000 Jews, almost all of those remaining in Ethiopia, were airlifted to Israel on 41 flights carried out in less than 30 hours in May 1991. At great risk had their departure been detected by those who opposed their escape.
I grew up with one dream, not to get the education, not to be doctor, not to be lawyer, just one dream, to get to Jerusalem one day.
Yarden Fanta was barely 12 years old when her family determined to escape the anti-Jewish repression of Ethiopia. They had long dreamed of building a new life in Israel, a place where they could openly celebrate their Jewish heritage.
After 1 year in the desert, finally came afternoon, 3 buses to pick us, some people to the airport. We were so excited, exhausted, and tired. And just we couldn't understand what's gonna happen, and we came to Israel. Sometimes you have a dream to touch the sky, and you touch it, and you don't understand how it happened. We just, looking around, and you can't believe it that it's happened.
Today, Israel is a rainbow nation with Jews of all colours, black and white, African, European, American, Asian, all making this promised land their home. And now we're going to think about the miracle of the Hebrew language. As Jews started coming back to Israel from all over the world, they all spoke different languages. It was clear that they needed one language to unite them. But what language could it be? Hebrew was the language of the Jewish Bible, and it hadn't been spoken by any Jew for hundreds of years. They just used it for reciting prayers and reading the scriptures in the synagogue. It wasn't the language of everyday life. Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism, thought that the Jews should adopt German as their native language because it was a modern language. But God had other ideas. Centuries before, it had been prophesied that God would turn the people back to a pure language so that they may all call upon the name of the Lord and serve him with one consent. It was hard to see how Hebrew could become the language of the Jews because there were no words for the modern world, no word for concrete or guns or cars or electricity. But through a miracle, God brought Hebrew back to his people as their national language.
If miracles have names, this one should have the name Eliezer ben Yehuda. A Lithuanian Jew, Ben Yehuda was just 12 years old when he had what he described as a vision. He said light flashed across the sky and a voice spoke 3 times the words, the land and the language. Somehow he understood his vision to be a life's calling for him to restore Hebrew to a common language in the land of the Bible. But as he grew to manhood in Moscow, he was caught up in the secularism of his day, eventually forsaking much of his Jewish faith and traditions. Graduating at the top of his class, he traveled to Paris with a scholarship to study medicine. Contracting tuberculosis, he was unable to continue his studies. Befriended by Baron Rothschild, who sponsored treatments for his recovery in Algiers, again one afternoon Ben-Yehuda heard the call, the land and the language. Baron Rothschild agreed to fund Ben-Yehuda's efforts. Despite his worsening tuberculosis, Ben-Yehuda moved to Jerusalem. He raised his children to know only Hebrew, made it the only language spoken in his home, published a newspaper in Hebrew, taught it as a spoken language in the school where he was employed. His crowning achievement was the 17 volumes of the Ben-Yehuda Dictionary Lexicon that became the guidebook for transforming an ancient tongue into a 20th century language. The miracle is that he stayed with it despite severe persecution, ridicule, the stoning of his son, the tragic loss of his wife. 1 month before he died in 1922, the British colonial government officially recognized Hebrew as the language of Palestinian Jews. Eliezer Ben-Yehuda had fulfilled his role in preparing for the miracle of Israel's rebirth on the 20th century world stage.
And now we're going to look at the miracle of the land. When the first settlers came back to the land of Israel, it was certainly not a land flowing with milk and honey. Most of it was empty and uninhabitable. An arid desert in the south gave way to disease-ridden malarial swamps in the centre and the north. But the pioneers started draining the swamps, irrigating the desert, turning the bare rocks into vineyards and the barren land into fertile soil. Within a decade of its independence, the state of Israel became self-sufficient in all foods apart from meat and grain. The Bible prophesied that when God brought his people home, there would be miracles in the sphere of agriculture. The desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose, Isaiah said. And that scripture has literally come true. 1/3 of all the flowers imported into Europe come from Israel. Every year, Israel exports 500 million stems of flower. Another scripture says, in the days to come, Jacob will take root, Israel will bud and blossom and fill all the world with fruit. Today, Israel is one of the world's leading citrus producers and exporters. More than 40 different types of fruit are grown in Israel and exported all over the world. Even the cows in Israel are miraculous, producing more milk per cow than any other nation in the world. How could that be possible in a land that is basically a desert? When you look at the pasture land that our cows enjoy in England or Australia or America, how is it that the Israeli cows produce 65% more milk than the European cows? The only explanation can be found in the Bible, which says that God will bless the crops of your land and the calves of your herds. The cows of Israel are certainly blessed by God. Lastly, we're going to think about the miracles of knowledge, business, and the economy. Israel is called by God to be a light to the world. Now, of course, part of that is undoubtedly sharing the spiritual knowledge of God with the rest of the world. But the Bible also says that my people perish for lack of knowledge. And knowledge is like a light that shows people the road to progress and development. And throughout all the ages and even today, people have died because they just haven't had the right knowledge. They haven't understood how they could turn the land around them into fertile agricultural land. Without science, without modern medicine, many people have died needlessly through lack of knowledge. The society of Israel is perhaps more full of knowledge than any other society on the face of the earth. And the amazing thing is that 70 years ago, which is not a long time, 70 years ago, Israel was an impoverished nation where people literally lived in shacks and many starved to death. Now, when you think about our nation, England, with our centuries-long tradition of learning, our universities going back to the Middle Ages, the libraries and the seats of scientific learning and history and all of that's been there for hundreds of years, this nation that's only been there for 70 years, this tiny geographical land that has almost no natural resources, that's surrounded by enemies and has been in a constant state of war since its founding. And remember, war is very expensive. It's a huge drain on a nation's economy. Yet in spite of all of that, Israel today is one of the richest countries. It's in the top 20 richest nations of the whole world, above France, Spain, Italy, South Korea, and all of the oil-rich Arab states. Even more amazing when you think that 9 out of 10 of Israel's population are immigrants of the first or second generation, many of whom arrived with literally no education and speaking all kinds of different languages. So how is it possible that today, from that background, now Israel has the largest number of scientists per capita, 60% more than their nearest competitor? How could tiny Israel possibly have more companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange than any other country in the world except for America and China? How is it that this small country has created more startup companies than the large, peaceful and stable nations like Japan, China, India, Korea, Canada and the United Kingdom? Per capita, there have been more entrepreneurs with startup businesses coming out of Israel than anywhere else in the world. And you know, many of the world's greatest inventions, especially in medicine and computing, have been created in Israel. Did you know that the first mobile phone was developed in Israel? The USB flash drive that many of us use every day. Computer firewalls, they were created in Israel. The world's first instant messaging app. Even the program behind Google traffic information was created in Israel. And then the system of drip irrigation that is used all over the world to irrigate crops in warmer countries, made in Israel. Solar water heating. Israel today develops more life-saving medical devices per capita than any other country in the world, with a yearly export of more than $3 billion. Isn't it amazing that Jews, who represent only 0.2% of the world's population, have won 20% of Nobel Prizes? And that goes up to 30% of prizes if you just look at physiology and medicine. How is all of this possible? The only explanation is that the God of Israel is with them. It says this in the Bible: the Lord will open for you his bounteous store, the heavens, to provide rain for your land in season, and to bless all your undertakings. You will be a creditor to many nations, but a debtor to none. When you look at the land of Israel, you can truly say that this is a land blessed by God. These are a people whom the Lord blesses all their undertakings.